So here I like to do it with a triangle. So for Hobbes, before the state is created, you have what he calls a multitude. A multitude is not a people, it's not a society, it's not a community. A multitude is a bunch of particular separate bodies, each of whom has plenty of reason to mistrust the others and to be in competition with the others. There's nothing uniting the members of the multitude initially. This multitude doesn't want to continuously fight itself. The particular people who make up this multitude don't want to be continuously scared of each other. So they come together to make a commonwealth. Now, if I were to ask you to draw a commonwealth, what would you draw? Maybe you would draw a flag. Maybe you would draw a crown. If I ask you to draw a multitude, it's very easy, right? You just draw a bunch of people who just seem to be different from each other. You could draw a bunch of people, and that would be a multitude. You would have depicted something that plausibly looks like what that is. But if I ask you to draw a commonwealth, you start drawing symbols of a commonwealth. You start drawing the flag of the commonwealth or the crown of the king who is running the commonwealth. You start engaging in a more abstract kind of activity. The reason for this is that on its own, a commonwealth doesn't have any kind of physical existence. On its own, a commonwealth is just an abstraction. So for Hobbes, to make the commonwealth real, to bring it into being, there has to be somebody who talks for it, who acts for it. The sovereign is the representative of the commonwealth. The sovereign personates the commonwealth. The sovereign makes a person out of the commonwealth. And it's only when the commonwealth becomes a person, that it's personated, that it can actually act in the real world. So, to have a commonwealth that can actually perform any of the peacemaking functions that commonwealths have, you need a sovereign to personate the commonwealth and bring it into being. So, the multitude, to have the commonwealth, has to authorize the sovereign to act on the commonwealth's behalf. But critically, for Hobbes, the multitude does not make any kind of deal with the sovereign. There is no agreement, no contract between the multitude and the sovereign. No. The agreement is among the multitude. So the members of the multitude agree to obey one person. They agree with each other to obey that one person and to authorize that one person to be the sovereign representative. This has led to some interesting theories, like the idea of the sleeping sovereign, the idea that the sovereign might not know that they're the sovereign because the sovereign is never a party to the contract. So suppose you all agreed that I was going to be the sovereign going forward and that you were going to do whatever I said. You might not tell me about this. You might just come up to me and ask my advice about different things and then do whatever I say to the letter without telling me that you're going to do that. And I might find that confusing. But if you all did this, if you all did actually, whenever you had a conflict, come to me for advice and do exactly what I said, then I would be functioning as the sovereign personator, arguably, on this theory. And I could do it without ever knowing about it. Of course, if I know about it, then I might act on the basis of being this figure. And maybe that would have certain benefits. Maybe if I knew I was this figure, I could institute some laws to provide a certain level of clarity. But you might also have reasons to not want me to know that I'm this person. Maybe you don't want the inconveniences of all of the further decisions I might take and make that might impinge upon your life in various ways. And you only want my advice in cases where you think you have a real serious conflict. So you might only come to me when you have a disagreement. In theory. Now, of course, in practice, this is not how these kingdoms actually work. But it's important to emphasize this because a lot of people assume that because this is social contract theory, that the king is a party to the deal, and therefore the king can be held in some way to the terms of the deal. No. The king is not answerable to the multitude. The multitude doesn't have any kind of unitary voice. The multitude, for Hobbes, is disunited. It doesn't have any particular views of its own. It can only have views of its own through the Commonwealth, which is personated by the sovereign. So whatever the multitude thinks or the multitude wants, that has no meaning until the sovereign speaks it into being. Because only the unity of the sovereign, the unity of the personator, allows the multitude to speak at all, to have any kind of unity. So, how could the multitude challenge what the sovereign does? The multitude can only have a view through the sovereign. The multitude cannot speak outside of this process for Hobbes. So there is never any point at which the sovereign can be out of alignment with society, out of alignment with the community, or out of alignment with the people. For Hobbes, no notion of society, community, or the people exists prior to the creation of the sovereign authority, which is why the only relationship after the sovereignty is created between the sovereign and multitude is one of command. The multitude, the members of the multitude, the fractious individuals, obey the sovereign. They obey the commands of the sovereign. They have no right to challenge the sovereign. Now, if the sovereign threatens your life, if the sovereign puts you in a situation where it's more dangerous to obey the sovereign than it is to disobey, then you have the right to disobey. But you have a right to disobey in this case that comes from nature, which comes from the natural rights of all people to try to preserve themselves, to seek peace, seek survival, and try to stay alive. So it's only if the sovereign transgresses against that, only if the sovereign puts you in a situation where it's more dangerous for you to be part of the Commonwealth than for you to not be, that you could have any kind of right to leave the Commonwealth, to disobey the sovereign, and to exit. So there is a possibility of rebellion here, but only in cases where the sovereign puts you in real serious danger. Interestingly enough, that danger doesn't necessarily have to be violence. It's not just that the sovereign, tries to kill you. If the sovereign puts you in a situation where you're struggling to survive because there isn't enough food, if the sovereign puts you in a humanitarian crisis where you're in danger of dying, if you obey the sovereign for other reasons that aren't to do with the sovereign immediately threatening you with violence, in those cases too you have the right to rebel. Any case where you have a survival interest that conflicts, you individually have the right to rebel, but just you individually. So for instance, if you're hungry, but the person next to you, they are still getting fed, the person getting next to you who's getting fed has no right to rebel. None. They have no right to try to have solidarity with you and to construct something independently with you. No. If they go and try to do that, the king has the right to regard them as engaging in treason and to regard them as an enemy of the state. So this element of the unity of the multitude, this is something that really distinguishes Hobbes and separates Hobbesians from, say, the followers of Marsilius, or as we'll see later on, the followers of Rousseau. Because for Hobbes, there is no unity prior to the state. There's never an independent, unitary people or society. So the state never answers to any other kind of abstract collectivity. There's no room in Hobbes' theory for abstract collectivities because they don't have bodies. They can't talk for bodies. And if you don't have bodies, and this is where the materialism of Hobbes, the physicalism of Hobbes is very critical. If you don't have a body and you can't talk, then you don't have a view. You don't have a position. You don't have a certain kind of ontic existence which is necessary to be a player. When you invoke something like society or the people for Hobbes, you are just pridefully making claims about abstractions agreeing with you. Abstractions that can't even have a view, can't even take a position outside of something like this process of Commonwealth and sovereign formation. In other kinds of accounts where the community exists prior to the state, the community gives the law, the state remains potentially answerable to the community through some mechanism. This is the more standard way of thinking in modernity.